Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And before to start my presentation, I would like, on behalf of all the members of Committee 4 of ICRP, to echo the introductory word of Werner Röhm, and to thank especially our Japanese colleague, but also all the people from Fukushima Prefecture and who suffer from the disaster, to exchange their experience. This is quite valuable for us, and we had the opportunity last week to discuss about that. We did that before, and to be honest, for the application of the system of radiological protection, to share this experience and to try to draw some lessons from what have been done and the management of the situation is quite important, and we expect to draw the lessons to improve the system of radiological protection in order to improve the protection of people on the environment. So for that, I would like to thank all from Japan and for their honest and share and transparency about all this experience. So, with regard to my presentation, I will focus on the current challenges of the application of the Commission recommendation. I hope not to be too conceptual. I will try to show you in which way the application of the system is really dedicated to improve the protection of people and the environment, and to check what need to be challenges in terms of principles. And of course, all these principles, all these recommendations need to be implemented in the practice. And then this is not the responsibility of ICRP to do it, but really to try to articulate the principle, the value, and the experience. Okay, so the objective of Committee 4 with regard to the application of the system is to provide advice on the general recommendation of ICRP to protect the people and the environment. And the objective is to do that in an integrated manner for all exposure situation. What I mean by all exposure situation, it's planned exposure situation, emergency situation, and existing exposure situation. I will not discuss, there is another domain of application, which is a medical field. This is a topic for Committee 3, so I will only focus on the application except the medical field. Sorry. Okay, so the current program of work of Committee 4, we have three main blocks. One is fundamental concept. A second one is dealing with radiological protection of the environment. And the third one is the application for specific domain. For the fundamental concept, currently we have different topics. The first one is reviewing the application of the approach in terms of exposure situation and categories of exposure. To be more explicit, this question of exposure situation have been introduced by publication 103, and then the objective since the publication 103 is to discuss more concretely what does it mean to apply the system not only in planned exposure situation, not only in case of emergency, but also to deal with radon exposure, to deal with legacy site, to deal with accidental situation and the recovery process. So I will come back more in detail on this first topic. The second topic in this fundamental concept is the principle of justification. I will also give more detail, and notably the justification with regard to existing exposure situation. The third one is something which has been addressed since a long time in ICRP. This is the question of optimization, and beside optimization, this is a question of tolerability of risk and reasonableness. And what we mean by these elements, these have been discussed when we developed the ethical principle for ICRP, but what are the value behind that, how to balance the different factors. This is something which is quite challenging. And then we have some other development together, notably with Committee 1, but not on the effect, but not only. The first one is the classification of harmful radiation-induced effect, and notably the question of circulatory disease or cataract, how to deal with that, how to integrate in the different principle of the application of the principle of radiation protection. The last one is individualization and stratification in radiological protection. More and more, notably in the medical field, we need to cope with characteristics of the individual. So what does it mean for the system in itself? This is a quite challenging issue, and we have a starting point on that. And the objective is not to have something where each individual will be protected differently, but it's really how to discuss, how to embark the characteristic of individual or characteristic of different group of population, and notably vulnerable population, how to cope with that in order to propose a system which is sufficiently efficient and will provide a good level of protection. With regard to the radiological protection of the environment, I will come back a little bit on this. We have three topics. The first one is reference animal and plants, and we have worked to improve the approach for this reference animal and plants. We have the second topic, which is how to consider the environment when we apply the system of radiological protection. We have the objective to have an integrated system protecting people and the environment. So how to cope with the different aspects and what are the main issues to be considered for when we want to protect the environment together with protection of the people. And the last one is considering the concept of ecosystem services, a concept which have been developed not in radiation protection, but largely all over the world to cope with the protection of the environment. And we need to check how far these tools which are developed in ecosystem services could be helpful for the implementation of the system of radiological protection. Then we have a series of topics for specific domain of application. The first one is surface and near-surface disposal of solid radioactive waste. In fact, this task group already finished its work, and the publication is in press. But then I will give some few elements, because this question of near-surface and surface disposal is something clearly at stake currently in the management of the Fukushima consequences. The second topic is areas contaminated by past activity or legacy, the management of legacy site. Again, this report has been open for public consultation till last September, and we are in the process to endorse the report. I will give you a few elements because it's echo significantly with management of decontamination of the site or decontamination of territories and management of material issued from this decontamination. The third one is the activity involving mobile high activity sources, and this is something which we're notably dealing with the occupational exposure associated with that, or the management of the sources. And the last one is something will go beyond the management of large accident, but considering emergency and malicious event. And unfortunately, in the context, in the international context, notably the war in Ukraine, this is something which have been largely in the actuality, in the news, and who make some information who have been provided on the website of ICRP, and notably to consider what to do in case of nuclear detonation. So we have two recent publications associated with Committee 4. The first one that you may know very well because it's have been largely and essentially developed with our Japanese colleague and the people from Fukushima. This is a publication 146 on radiological protection of people and the environment in the event of a large nuclear accident. I will not come back too much on this because I think you already have presentation on this topic. The second one is publication 153, which have been developed in connection with Committee 3, which deal with radiological protection in veterinary practice, something which increased significantly and which may also call for further development. With regard to the two forthcoming publications, the first one on near-surface and near-surface disposal for solid radioactive waste, I just quoted some few elements of the main point. The first one for near surface associated with nuclear fuel cycle. This is, of course, a planned exposure situation, but there is a need to have appropriate consideration of the time frames and related uncertainty. And in fact, we had discussion with people from the interim storage facility this week, and clearly this question of the time frame, how to cope with the different step in the future, how to embark uncertainty about the possible exposure of people and the impact on the environment. This is something which need to be articulated with what have been produced in this report. The second point is that optimization of protection is an essential element and essential principle and need to be considered throughout all life phases. And when we say throughout all life phases, that means, of course, at the design stage, but during the operation, at the time of the surveillance, but also for the long term. And then clearly, the question of how to protect future generations is something which is clearly at stake, and how to articulate the current protection with the future protection of future generation and protection of the environment in the future. This is a challenging issue, which is also common with the question associated with the interim storage facility or with the waste coming from the dismantling of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The last point which have been highlighted in this report is that there is a need to have appropriate mechanism for formal and structured dialogue between the regulator and the operator, of course, but also with stakeholders. And then when we mention structured dialogue, it's something that needs to be considered since the beginning and to be articulated all over the life of the waste disposal. With regard to the second report on radiological protection in areas contaminated by past activity, this is existing exposure situation, and the key point is really to apply a graded approach and integrated all hazard approach. In most of the case, radiological issues are not the only concern, and then there is a need to balance the different facets of the situation. We have identified several phases for the remediation process. The first is the recognition of the exposure situation. The second is characterization of the situation. The third is planning of remediation. The fourth is implementation of remedial action plan. And the fifth, which is also quite important, is the post-remediation management. And these 5 phases are clearly well articulated with the current situation with regard to the management of removed soil from the decontamination activity in Fukushima. We mentioned that for this, the management of this type of situation, early, broad and ongoing stakeholder involvement is essential. The reference level for public protection is selected in the lower range of the 1 to 20 millisievert per year. And it is important to mention that in this report there are several case studies, and this is interesting to draw the lessons from this case study and to see which type of radiological criteria have been selected depending on the specific circumstances, depending on the situation. And then there is also a key issue with regard to the management of workers, and of course, these workers who have to decontaminate the site are considered as occupationally exposed workers. Although we are in an existing exposure situation, at the end, for the long term, for the decontamination, we are in position to manage them and to consider significantly their exposure. Then I will go through a few elements in terms of the ongoing work. The first one is the discussion we had on the approach in terms of exposure situation and categories of exposure. And we had discussion last week with our Japanese colleague, and we had also the opportunity to discuss with the Ministry of the Environment. And clearly, this discussion on reviewing the application of the approach in terms of exposure, and notably for existing exposure and the transition from the different phase, has clearly highlighted some challenges for the application of the system. The aim of this work is to understand how the current system has been implemented in different situations and how effective the implementation has been in improving radiation protection. The objective of introducing different categories of different situations of exposure is not just for conceptual approach, is really because at the end we are convinced that we will improve the protection. So this is something that we need to challenge and to review the application to be sure that the way we have explained this exposure situation and categories of exposure are sufficiently helpful to improve the radiation protection of people and the environment. There are some issues which have been highlighted at this stage in this ongoing work, and we will have the opportunity to have an open workshop on this topic in the future. The first element is that we need to clarify the definition of type of exposure situation. We mean existing exposure situation and planned exposure situation. This is not fully understood equally depending on the situation. So we need to clarify this definition. We need to have guidance on the practical use of reference level, dose constraint, and the implication of this concept in the different situations. We, of course, need to discuss the transition between the exposure situation, and here you are very well placed to understand what is the meaning beside this question of transition, and we certainly need to learn more about what you have done and what could be the explanation for better clarifying this the way to apply the transition between exposure situation. We have also this question, similarly to the task group on legacy site, on classification of workers in case of existing exposure situation. We have to think how to deal with sources or events that cut across multiple categories of exposure, and then how to apply the graded exposure. So this is good to say we need to have a graded exposure, but in practice, what does it mean and what ICRP can recommend, notably for existing exposure situation. And then so this is again some current challenge. I have no answer. It's just some preliminary element. How to improve the usability of the system. First element is by emphasizing on the unintended and advantageous use of radioactivity, the harmonization of definition of existing exposure situation. We have to clarify the meaning of tolerability and acceptability in case of existing exposure situation. We need to explain the assignment of existing or plan to a situation, that this is not based on the level of exposure. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. It's not the level of exposure who will define the type of exposure situation, but clearly the characteristic of this exposure situation. And we need to state clearly that there is no prospect of radiological emergency when we are in existing exposure situation. And of course, we then need to deal with the justification principle, which is also a second topic of concerns that we have in Committee 4. So moving to this second topic on principle of justification, it was first introduced by ICRP a long time ago in publication 26. This is interesting to see the way in the medical field they applied the principle of justification, introducing 3 levels for medical exposure, depending on the situation. So some broad level of justification for the practice, some element more specific to a techniques, or just at the level of the patient. This is described in publication 103 as any decision that alters the radiation exposure situation should do more good than harm. So this is a good principle. It has been recalled by Chris Clement previously in the ethical principle. So this is good to say we need to do more good than harm, but then what more good than harm mean in society today? How, on what basis the judgment should be made? How to consider the value benefit, how to consider and value, benefit of protecting non-human species. What does it mean for ecosystem? And how to identify and involve stakeholders in the process of justification. And the point which have been emphasized at this stage is that, in fact, notably for existing exposure situation, justification is ultimately judged by society. And so what does it mean to embark that? And ethical considerations are essential in this process. Nowadays, all the questions of sustainable development are present in this discussion and probably can guide the justification decision. We can identify a wide range of factors or aspects that need to be considered. And probably radiation exposure are often relatively minor issue in case of existing exposure situation. We need to have rigor in justification process, and that should be proportionate to the magnitude of radiation risk and the complexity of the issue, and we need to be transparent on this process. There is a need to revisit the link between justification and optimization depending on the situation. Sometimes, and we have seen that in the medical field, that the two concepts are echoing themselves. And justification decision always entail uncertainty, and we need to cope with this uncertainty. Then with regard to the tolerability and reasonableness, this is, as I mentioned, a topic which has been present in ICRP since a long time. We are nowadays revisiting the framework of tolerability, and we discuss first the tolerability of risk with regard to the level of individual exposure, and then we can try to define what is not tolerable and what is tolerable, but in fact, there is no universal value. And we can define some radiological criteria associated with tolerability, but it's clearly, depending on the situation, there is a range of value. It's something which could evolve with time. So this is something to be better characterized. And then when we discuss the tolerability of risk, we can move forward to the optimization process. And the optimization process is not necessarily to reduce exposure as much as possible, but is to reduce or to maintain exposure as reasonably achievable. And this question of reasonableness interact with relationship, resources, rational, and then behind that, you have a series of factors. I have no time to go in detail, but this is important to consider that as a process. And the general consideration that we have for this topic is that, in fact, the emphasis needs to be put on the level of protection. The objective is not to have a level of risk, but really to have a level of protection. The objective is to reach a good level of protection with due consideration given to the level of risk associated with ionizing radiation under specific circumstances. But not only, we also need to include some question of well-being, some question of sustainable development, to embark all hazard approach and many other considerations. Again, this is important to consider as a process. And when we say a process, this is an iterative process, and we do not reach a level of reasonableness forever. This is something which needs to be revisited regularly, depending on the evolution of the situation. So again, the relationship between justification and optimization need to be considered. We have to consider the prevailing circumstances and the specificity of the situation, and so it's why there is no universal value again. There is a need to ensure the respect of ethical value, and also, of course, to rely on stakeholder involvement in order to balance the different factors and to be sure that the good level of protection is something which is shared between the different stakeholders. With regard to the protection of the environment, we have currently three task groups discussing this topic. So we try to define what means the environment, and we check, for example, the definition of the Oxford English Dictionary, which means that the environment is defined as the physical surroundings or condition in which a person or other organism lives, develops, or in which a thing exists, and the external condition in general affecting the life, existence, or properties of an organism or an object. And so roughly speaking, we can say that we have a broad objective for the environment. The first one is conservation of natural resources. The second one is maintenance of biodiversity. But then we have also to cope with economic impact and recreational and cultural value. With regard to reference animal and plants, I'm sorry, with RAP, I just mentioned, I didn't give the definition here, but RAP means reference animal and plant. We have a task group working on improving the representativeness of these reference animal and plant with respect to biodiversity, in order to have an effective use of the latest transfer and effect data, and with some discussion how to embark the different level between family level or class level, and what is the best option depending on the available data, in order to define some reference level which are meaningful and helpful to protect the environment. And then there is a discussion on the endpoint sensitivity distribution, and the objective is really to be sure that at the end we will have a good protection depending on the situation. Considering, we have a second task group which try to see in practice what does it mean besides the concept, how to apply the concept. And then there is consideration of the environmental impact, notably the environmental impact due to the implementation of protective action in case of remediation or after a nuclear accident. There are different case studies which confirm the need for integrated approach across all environmental detriment and benefit. And then we can check the potential radiological impact, which in some cases could have more significance for small population, and then we need to better understand what does it mean and to make some proposal in this perspective. And then we are currently discussing, you know that we have three categories of exposure in the system of radiological protection. We have public, workers and patients. And of course, we try to consider what does it mean? Is it meaningful to introduce a fourth category for the environment, and how to do it? For ecosystem services and sustainable development, I will not go too far, but this is, as I mentioned, an approach which has been developed to discuss the protection of the environment in different aspects, and we try to see how this type of tool could support holistic approach. We explore how these different tools which investigate and propose some quantitative and qualitative indicators to evaluate the situation of the environment, how it can be useful to discuss the sustainable development and to discuss the quality of life. And these ecosystem services discuss the articulation between protection of people and the environment. I will try to finish very quickly. Just to mention, with regard to the protection of the environment, we have, and beyond the protection of the environment, at the initiative of the chair of ICRP, Werner Rühm, there is a paper which has been published quite recently on the system of radiological protection and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And then you can see, you can download this paper, and it's the first proposal to check how the ICRP system cope with UN Sustainable Development Goal. And we identify some key challenges for ethics and sustainable development. We first need to define and apply the concept of well-being, how in the new recommendation we will define this objective, how to better address the protection of various vulnerable populations, and how to discuss the value of the environment. And of course, when we check the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, how to balance the different effects with holistic and integrated approach. To conclude, we have some remaining issue. In fundamental principle, we need to better address the holistic approach. We need to revisit the concept of limits. We need to go beyond. We had defined some ethical value, or we have clarified the ethical value underpinning the system of radiological protection, but nowadays we would like to check in practice what does it mean, how ICRP could help to clarify the application of this ethical and societal consideration in the different domains where the system of radiological protection is implemented. And then the last one is addressing the application of the UN Sustainable Development Goal. For the application of the system beyond the principle, we have few aspects with regard to stakeholder involvement, education and training, dialogue and communication. We are discussing the role of artificial intelligence, how it can affect the application of the system. In the medical field, this is clearly an issue at stake, but probably for other domains. And we also have some discussion on the application of radiological protection in space. So with that, I thank you for your attention.